All right, guys, today we're going to talk about the origin of life. We've been talking about evolution and the evolutionary history of life, and it can be documented with evidence, whereas the origin of life on Earth is another story. So what is life? Well, first we have to define life. Life is organized as cells. It responds to stimuli from the environment. Living things regulate internal processes. They maintain homeostasis. They use energy to grow. That involves metabolism, chemical reactions. They develop, they change and mature within their lifetime. Again, that can vary how dramatic that is from species to species. They reproduce. They make more living things. That allows heredity or passing of traits from parent to offspring through DNA, RNA, things like that. Allows for adaptation and evolution. So there are several hypotheses about how life could have begun. Special creation is one. Was life created by a supernatural or divine force? This is not testable in science, so we're not going to address that one. Extraterrestrial origin. Was the original source of organic material comets or meteorites striking early Earth? That is testable. It's called panspermia is the name for that theory. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But we're going to focus primarily on this last one, spontaneous abiotic origin. Did life evolve spontaneously from inorganic molecules? This seems like the most likely of the three. And it is testable. So one of the things we know is the conditions on early Earth were probably very different from what they are today. What was missing from the atmosphere? Well, as you know, photosynthesis wasn't around, so there wouldn't have been much oxygen. And when oxygen's low, organic molecules don't break down as quickly as they do today. So the atmosphere was likely reducing atmosphere because it didn't have much oxygen. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrogen gas, ammonia, methane, hydrogen sulfide, all would have likely been found in the atmosphere, which would allow for lots of available hydrogens, electrons to allow for reduction. No free oxygen though. You would need an energy source for this to work. Could be provided through lightning, UV radiation, or volcanic activity. The abiotic synthesis theory was first proposed in 1920 by Operin and Haldane, where they proposed the reducing atmosphere hypothesis. Tested in 1952, published their results in 1953. Miller and Urey tested it using this apparatus you can see here. This part here represents the heated ocean. This part here represents the atmosphere, and this is where the things would have collected. It formed organic compounds, amino acids, adenine, etc. This is the actual apparatus with Stanley Miller here. You can see some of the things that were produced. Origin of cells, protobionics or protocells were bubbles that could give birth to smaller bubbles or liposomes. And these liposomes can, if the enzymes are present, allow for simple metabolism to occur and to export the products of that metabolism. RNA is likely the first genetic material. The RNA first hypothesis, we'll talk a little bit about. RNA is likely the first genetic material for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's multifunctional. It codes for information. It's a self-replicating molecule, so this makes inheritance possible. We can pass RNA from generation to generation. Allows natural selection and evolution to work. It can function as an enzyme. Those are called ribozymes, Replication is the primary function of these enzymes. Regulatory molecule, transport molecules like mRNA and tRNA are also possible. So what are some of the key events in the evolutionary history of life on Earth? Well, we think life would have begun about 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. Prokaryotes would have been the dominant form till about 2.0 billion years ago. You can see here's a fossil evidence of a chain of bacteria from 3.5 billion years ago. and here's modern chains of a bacteria called cyanobacteria. You can see the similarities there. Other evidence of prokaryotes include prokaryotes forming microbial colonies, include the stromatolites. I find these in shallow waters around the world. See different examples there. A big event in the history of life was oxygen in the atmosphere. We can see in the rock strata, rock layer, evidence of oxidizing atmosphere with iron in the rocks rusting or oxidizing, starting at about 2.7 billion years ago. So this meant that probably photosynthesis had evolved in blue-green bacteria, and this allowed aerobic respiration and larger organisms and things to form. The first eukaryotes, about 2 billion years ago, they show up, created internal environments, allowed for specialization, increased efficiency. So you had infolding of the plasma membrane starting to form compartments, which would have led to things like the endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus, the Golgi apparatus, and so on. Mitochondria and chloroplasts, we think, came about from the endosymbiosis or endosymbiotic theory. Started out as a mutualistic relationship where a bacteria lived inside a larger cell and benefited from that relationship. So these would have been some of the first single-celled eukaryotes. So there's the mitochondria there. We think that chloroplasts probably developed the same way. Probably would have been a photosynthetic bacteria that was part of this mutually beneficial relationship. So Lynn Margulis is the one who's credited with this theory of endosymbiosis. And the evidence, structural evidence, mitochondria and chloroplasts resemble bacteria in their structure. Their DNA in the mitochondria and chloroplasts is circular DNA, like bacterial DNA, unlike eukaryotic DNA. And it has its own unique genetic code. Mitochondria and chloroplasts can move within the cell, and they can also reproduce on their own independent from the cell. They do it through binary fission, which is the same way that bacteria reproduce. Big point in history of life on Earth was the Cambrian explosion, where most of the major phyla of animals appear in the fossil record between a 10 and 20 million year period, starting at about 543 million years ago. This is just showing kind of some of the things that happen in different periods throughout the history of life on Earth and how that corresponds with the breaking apart of Pangaea into the modern continents we have today. The Cambrian explosion, you can see here on this where it happened. The red line represents the increase in different kinds of living things and different families of living things, and the blue line represents extinction rates. You can see some of the mass extinction events that have happened throughout history. The Cretaceous extinction, we think, was caused by a meteor strike in the Caribbean Sea near the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico that would have created a lot of dust in the atmosphere, cooled the Earth worldwide, and led to the extinction of dinosaurs and the evolution of mammals, which began about 125 million years ago. And when the dinosaurs went extinct, they were able to expand into habitats they didn't have access to before. And mammals eventually become the dominant form of life on Earth that they are today. So molecular data at one point challenged the 5 kingdom system that we used to have: Monera, Protists, Plantae, Fungi, and Animalia. Monera was too diverse. 2 distinct lineages of prokaryotes appear to show up in the history of life on Earth. Protists are still too diverse, and so there's some ideas about possibly breaking those up as well. But that's not really been sorted out. Protists are kind of like, well, you're a eukaryote, you're not an animal, a plant, or fungus, so you end up in the Protist kingdom. Domains were added later. 3 domains: Archaea, which are bacteria more similar to eukaryotes and typically live in extreme environments, extremophiles, methanogens, halogens, thermophiles, and then the eukaryotes, things that have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So there's our different domains here. See some examples of each one there.